Kia ora koutou. I can see people are arriving, which is wonderful. Kia ora koutou. My name is Beattie, and I'm very much looking forward to presenting about my research about dark patterns and their impacts in Aotearoa New Zealand, also on privacy. I've just been instructed to talk about how the session is going to work. I'm going to deliver a webinar. I'll be sharing my screen shortly and you'll see my slides. I think I'm probably going to talk for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit over. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And if you'd like to ask a question, which I would love, please use the Q&A functionality in Zoom, as opposed to raising your hand as we might tend to use in a Zoom meeting. So if you could use the Q&A functionality, it's next to the chat down the bottom. I think that's how we're going to be doing questions and answers. So that's what I've been told. So yeah, otherwise I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to start talking, and hopefully you're going to start enjoying my talk. So bear with me. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. Maybe someone can confirm that in the chat, and I'm just going to start talking. So welcome to my talk. Thank you, Abby. Welcome to my talk about dark patterns and the New Zealand web. I am Dr. Beattie. It's not often you use your PhD title, but I guess in a public talk you might. I'm from the School of Science and Society at Te Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. And today I'm going to be talking about dark patterns, whether or not they're here on the New Zealand internet, and how they impact user privacy. So just to give you a kind of a structure for the talk, I'm just going to give a bit of background so we don't just sort of jump straight into dark patterns. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background about who I am as a researcher, what I research, and how I got to dark patterns, and then a bit of an overview of what a dark pattern is. Then I'll talk specifically about my research, this paper in particular that was published about 2 weeks ago. So it's relatively new. And then I'll finish with a where to next. So some sort of open questions that I'm really keen to get feedback. I'll talk about my next research project that I'm hoping to do, that I'm currently designing, and then also some kind of bigger, broader questions around what do we do about dark patterns? So that's an overview for the talk. So to give you a kind of a bigger picture, I'll start off about a little bit about myself. I promise not to talk about myself for too much, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what I do. So I did a PhD recently. I come from media or internet studies. I study the internet. And for my PhD specifically, I studied the emergence of these sorts of apps that you use to use your phone less. So you might have used Freedom, you might have used an app called Forest, you might have used Screen Time. These apps use design, use psychology to try to encourage you to use your phone less. Gamification is another thing they use. They use color, they use aesthetic. I really got into this topic for my PhD, and I learned about the importance of design and the significance of embedding behavioral science into software and into the design of digital environments. And which eventually led me towards dark patterns. So that's the sort of wider context around me and why I researched dark patterns. It was part of my PhD. So what's a dark pattern? Maybe you've heard of the term before, maybe you haven't, but you've definitely probably encountered one. The term dark pattern was coined by a user experience designer called Harry Brignall back in 2013. There's a photo of Harry there on the screen. And it refers to a type of design trick, or type of design, rather, that is intended to trick the user. People like myself, you, who are using the internet. When we navigate websites, we are a user. And the purpose of a dark pattern is that it intentionally is there to mislead you for some sort of purpose, to benefit the website or the business behind the website. And that's what makes it dark. It's intentionally misleading or malicious. And so the term's been around since 2013, kind of still new. And there's a formal kind of academic definition, if that's your thing, on the screen there. And there's lots of different types. And that's one thing that I'll probably try to get across in this talk. So it's quite a broad thing because it's about design. And you think about the huge variety of ways in which websites can be designed. There's lots of different types of dark patterns. And there's sort of a lack of consistency perhaps as a result, which makes them sometimes quite tricky to study. So to give you some examples, quite a common one is obstruction, or informally known as privacy zuckering. So if you've ever tried to change your privacy settings on Facebook or another social media platform, it can often be quite difficult. And the point here is that it's deliberate. I just see there's a question in the chat. So thank you for asking, Hazel. I think moving forwards, I'll ignore the questions until the end. But what I'll say is that the paper is open source, sorry, open access. So there's a link later on, you'll see, and anyone can read the paper. So there's no paywall for my research. But moving forward, I'll try to ignore the questions until the end. I won't ignore them in general. I'm definitely keen to engage. So back to obstruction or privacy zuckering. So this is where the purpose of the dark pattern is to obstruct you from doing something that you want to do. So say you want to change your privacy settings, it's very hard to do so. And so what tends to happen on platforms like Facebook or Instagram, your privacy settings are buried quite deeply into the menu bar to try and deter you from finding them. And so the image on the screen here is of when Facebook had to change their data settings following the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations. And you can see here on the screen that there are certain design choices that orients the user towards outcomes that the platform wants you to choose. So they want you to accept and continue. That button is colored blue. But to change your settings, you have to click through manage first and then do some other kind of toggling. So it's not a neutral choice. It's one choice is clearly prioritized over the other. And the term privacy zuckering is a sort of play off the idea of being a sucker. You're suckered into giving more data, and off the name of the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. So that's one example. Another one type of dark pattern is called forced action. And this is an infamous, the image on the screen here is an infamous example from 2015 with LinkedIn. You might remember if you used LinkedIn back then, LinkedIn would ask you for your email address through the registration process and not really tell you why, but also use design to encourage you to give away your email without really properly thinking. So you can see here on the screen, the box to put your email is here in yellow, and then right below it is the continue button, right below it. More hidden is the actual option to skip this step, but it's not as easy to find. And so you can see why people who are just sort of going through the process quite quickly will just press continue. And even if you manage to click skip the step, you have an additional window that you have to get through where you are encouraged again through the use of design to just agree. So fine now is encouraged through it's colored, and skip is more subtle, it's gray, and so forth. This was actually also called address book leeching. So there's often quite like crossover between dark patterns. And again, one of the difficulties in sort of research in the area, there's sort of inconsistent definitions. So there's a little kind of an overview of dark patterns, what they are. And you can probably think of other examples because they tend to be everywhere. But to sort of shift towards the research that I actually did, so myself and my colleagues, Dr. Sheree Lacey and Dr. Tristan Sparks, we were aware of dark patterns, and we thought, man, this is something that's out there and is concerning, but are they here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? A lot of the research had been conducted in America or Europe and on these platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Amazon, and so forth. We wanted to get an idea of whether they were here in New Zealand on .co.nz websites. And so whether or not New Zealand internet users were encountering dark patterns when they were accessing the New Zealand web. So we thought, well, let's look at dark patterns in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And more than that, we wanted to use sort of the strengths of our discipline. So Without going into too much academic detail, we come from fields such as internet studies and science and technology studies, which are fields where we sort of look at the crossover between design and industry, and how industry incentives and economics can encourage certain things. So rather than debating the morals or ethics of dark patterns, which previous studies had done, we wanted to really simply figure out, well, why were they there? What was driving them? What purpose were the dark patterns serving? And once we got a kind of a picture of whether they were here in New Zealand, we could kind of investigate that sort of thing. So that's the sort of broader picture around our paper. And as you can see here on the bottom of the screen, there's actually a link to the article itself, which I mentioned is open access. So anyone can read it. It's absolutely free. So in any good research projects, you ask research questions. And so I won't go into too much detail, but to give you a good sense of what research we actually found, I need to firstly tell you what were the questions that we asked. So first of all, we asked, what sort of websites, or where would New Zealand internet users most likely encounter dark patterns, right? So if you're browsing the so-called New Zealand internet, where are you going to encounter them? Secondly, what are the most common types of dark patterns? You'll see what I mean when I get into the data there. What are the different types of dark patterns that you might encounter? And then thirdly, and this is the most academic-y type question, the so what. Okay, so once we know where you would encounter dark patterns and what types, what does that tell us about the production of dark patterns, why they're being made, what do they serve, that kind of thing. And hopefully I'll make that more clear when I answer it. So those are the questions that we asked. And then a little detail about how we did it, because I do think it's quite helpful when we talk about investigating the New Zealand internet. That's quite vague. And so we had to be very specific, and I hope that this is helpful to show you how we did it. So first of all, we had to be very clear about what we meant by a dark pattern. That's what we called a coding instrument. And then we had to determine what was in scope. When we say the New Zealand internet, do you mean every single .co.nz website? That sounds unrealistic to be able to achieve. How did we analyze each website? So what were our user journeys? And then how did we actually go through and do the analysis? So a little bit more on each step, if I may. So first of all, we had to be clear about what was a dark pattern, what was not. So that meant going through all the previous research, seeing how they had come up with all these terms, all these sorts of categories, and sort of consolidating them into an ultimate list. So here I've got some examples on the screen of what a dark pattern is. And as you can see, there's sort of higher level categories: nagging, obstruction, sneaking, interface, interference, forced action, and then within them, lower, more specific categories. So it can get quite complex, and there often can be lots of crossover, but it was important that we had some sort of ultimate list, a very, thorough, as exhaustive as possible, so we could spot as many dark patterns as possible. That was the first thing we had to do. Develop that kind of instrument to be able to spot the dark pattern, right? Like, I guess if you're a birder and if you want to go into the wild and look at birds, you need a list of all the birds, so you know what you're looking for. Second of all, we had to determine what was in scope. So as I said, there's probably thousands, tens of thousands of websites with a .co.nz domain. We had to make the study feasible. There was only 3 of us, and so we decided to limit our scope in a couple of ways. First of all, we decided to only look at websites. So there are apps, right? There are other types of digital environments that are worth looking at when it comes to being manipulated online. Those would be awesome to look at, but we decided that we would only look at websites only, and maybe another study could look at apps. So first of all, we decided to only look at websites. And then second of all, to sort of get a sense of the New Zealand internet, we decided to think about the most popular or most used 100 websites. So to do that, we turned to a company called Alexa, which can tell you based on user traffic what are the most popular .co.nz websites in a particular time period. So we picked a 3-month period in 2021. And following that, we actually managed to generate a list of the top 100 websites with the .co.nz domain. And within that list were media websites like Stuff, New Zealand Herald, lots of e-commerce websites like Farmers, Harvey Norman, JB Hi-Fi, banking websites, university websites, government services, those sorts of things. So yeah, quite an exhaustive list, and one that we are ready to jump into. And then for anyone that knows a little bit about user experience, websites can sometimes be very small and sometimes be very big, particularly with these top 100 websites. You think about a university website or a shopping website, they can have a lot of pages, which raises the question, well, how would you analyze something like that? That could be a nightmare. How can you be consistent throughout your top 100 websites? So we decided to be very clear about what we'd call our user journeys. This is a term from user experience design. How do you consistently analyze each website? So we came up with 6 user journeys that we would look at if they were relevant to each website. So first of all, what happens when you arrive on the homepage of the website? So farmers.co.nz, when you arrive on that website, what happens? Do you encounter any dark patterns? That was one user journey, the arrival. Second of all, if you can sign up or register, what's the process? How does it happen? Are there any dark patterns? That's another user journey. Thirdly, if you can purchase anything, so adding an item to your shopping cart, what happens then? What's that specific journey? If it was a website with any media, so things like Stuff, New Zealand Herald, or Neon, or Spark Sport back then, or Sky Sport, how do you engage with the media? What happens? That sort of thing. If it's a business and you want to contact them, what's the journey there? How do you go from wanting to contact the business to actually finding the information you need to be able to contact them? So that was another journey that we wanted to focus on. And then finally, canceling. So canceling a service that you've subscribed to, or maybe something that you've purchased. So 6 clear journeys that gave us the ability to be consistent with our analysis of the top 100 websites. And then lastly, actually doing our analysis. So this wasn't just plucked out of the air. There are specific methods that we employed, and one in particular that comes from internet studies or media studies. It's called the walkthrough method, something that I've used a lot in my research. And if there are any gamers in the audience, you might be familiar with gaming walkthroughs, and this method actually was inspired by that kind of thing. A gaming walkthrough is often a large text that will describe step by step how to play a game, or how the game is intended to be used. So player wakes up, player walks out of the house, player picks up a sword. The idea is that the walkthrough method describes at length how the digital environment is supposed to be used, how it is intended to be used. It also is inspired by human-computer interaction design methods and UX itself. So trying to understand how users might use the digital environment, and so designers can sort of tweak things based on that sort of feedback. So we use the walkthrough method to understand how users are supposed to arrive on the website, how they're supposed to go through the shopping cart process, and that kind of thing. And using our coding instrument, once we encountered a dark pattern, we would note it on a spreadsheet. And the first author, Sri Lacey, and myself went through, and we walked through the top 100 websites as a team. And when we found a dark pattern, would code it. And then the third author would do it themselves, not seeing our data set, and would do their own walkthroughs of the top 100 websites. And then afterwards, we compared notes. We had robust discussions when we disagreed, and then we would vote to try and find some kind of consistency. And it took a while, but we ended up creating a big data set that I'll show you shortly. And there were a few notable limitations that's definitely worth mentioning. First of all, we couldn't access all top 100 websites. You think of banking websites or governments or specific social services websites. There are barriers there for good reason, and so we ended up having to discard them from our list. And also some user journeys we couldn't fully complete while we did simulate purchasing a service, say on Neon or Spark Sport, and then to cancel it, we didn't end up purchasing items on all the retail and e-commerce websites like Harvey Norman or JB Hi-Fi or Farmers, because we just didn't simply have the resources to do so. And also we just didn't want to end up with a lot of stuff that we didn't want. So there were some notable limitations to this research that we want to be very clear about. So if you're interested in our results, in our complete table of analysis, well, you can access it on the Open Science Framework. There's a link down there at the bottom. Our paper also refers to this, but because it's quite a big document that's unwieldy, it's got its sort of separate link. So if you're interested to see all the dark patterns that we found back in 2021, there's a link there for you to access. But luckily, I have prepared the data in a much more visible and palatable form. So moving to our results, what did we find? Well, if we go back to the research questions, what we found were as follows. So the first research question you might remember was, where are New Zealand internet users most likely to encounter dark patterns? So this bar chart shows quite clearly that the most common instance where a New Zealand internet user is most likely to encounter the dark pattern is when they are purchasing something. So when you are adding something to your shopping cart on a retail website, when you are browsing for something, when you are trying to close the deal and so forth, that is when you're most likely to encounter a dark pattern. That was the overwhelming finding. This is followed by arriving on the website. So the second biggest skyscraper here you can see is arrival. So when you land on a website, we found that you're very likely to have a pop-up window that's trying to get you to do something, or maybe it's a cookie consent pop-up where design is used to encourage you to consent to the cookies. That was very common. And then, as you can see here on cancel, so what was also, what stood out was if you were trying to cancel a subscription to a service or purchasing a product, you were often obstructed from being able to do so. So that was also pretty common. And then this blue, I'm not sure if people can see my mouse, but the tallest light blue skyscraper under purchase force action, we found that people were often forced to register as opposed to having a guest account when purchasing an item. And I've got more slides to sort of visualize this later on, but I'm just trying to give you a high level picture. And perhaps what I should have said to lead the results is that what we found was that the majority of New Zealand websites that we analyzed had a dark pattern. So over 50% of websites within our scope of analysis had a dark pattern. So the majority of New Zealand websites have dark patterns. That was the takeaway that we came from that. Second research question, what were the most common types of dark patterns? So you would have sort of got an idea of this from the last screen, but the most common one was interface interference. So pop-up interstitial windows, lots of sorts of those, whether it's a media website when you're being encouraged to subscribe or donate, or when you're buying something and you're encouraged to think about something else, you may like this. That was the most common type of dark pattern, and it's probably the broadest high-level category, which we had some debate around, but that was the most common by far. But I think the research question that is the most interesting is this last one, research question 3, which basically means, so now that we know that dark patterns are deployed in New Zealand web around the purchasing process and most often interface interference, okay, what does that say about why dark patterns are deployed? I've got some visuals to explain that. So the so what? So one of the key conclusions that we came up with was that because dark patterns are so commonly used around e-commerce websites and to around the purchasing process, is that dark patterns are key mechanisms to drive sales in the online environment. So here we've got a picture of Culture King's website, and once you add an item to your shopping cart, interface interference occurs, and you're encouraged to think about something else. And also on the right here, you can see design is being used to some certain options are colored, certain options are not. There's quite a lot going on. So one key kind of point was dark pattern as a mechanism to drive sales. Another example here, in New Zealand, for anyone that's ever bought a ticket in New Zealand, you are encouraged to purchase a seat for an additional price. And if you see here, you can skip, but you are discouraged through the use of design to do so. Skipping down the bottom here, skip seat select is a less obvious option. So again, the dark pattern is deployed to drive sales, to get you to purchase a seat. Another example here is the New Zealand Herald. So for anyone that's subscribed to the Herald, it's pretty easy to subscribe, but much harder to cancel. And this is where the dark pattern of obstruction comes in. So to cancel with the New Zealand Herald, you have to click through to your managed subscriptions and find the right button. And once you've managed to do that, you actually then have to do an additional step and call a number. And when I did this, I was asked to provide a reason to cancel my subscription. So there's a number of steps that you go through before you can actually cancel. And so it's definitely not a neutral process compared to subscribing. Second of all, and most relevant to Privacy Week, is that we concluded that dark patterns are mechanisms to encourage the disclosure of personal data. So because quite a number of retail and e-commerce websites force you to register before purchasing an item, or use design to strongly encourage you to register over using a guest account, our takeaway from this was that the dark pattern works here to encourage you giving away more personal data, because when you register, more questions tend to be asked, sometimes around age or gender, and therefore you're giving away more data about yourself. So that's why we concluded that a dark pattern also serves this kind of goal as well. And there are other instances of screenshots that I could have provided, but this was the best one that I could provide at the time. We also looked at, from memory, the user journey of trying to contact the business, right? So you're on Spark, you're wanting to call, maybe you're also on 2 Degrees, or you're on some kind of provider, the website of a provider, and you're wanting to call them to discuss something. And as we all know, it's often quite hard to get hold of a number. Often you're orientated towards FAQs or a chatbot. We call this contact zuckering to play off privacy zuckering. And the conclusion that we drew from this was the dark pattern in this instance, the obstructing you from actually finding a number, is to reduce the cost of running a call center. If less people call the call center, it's a more affordable business cost. So the reason why you're driven or triaged towards FAQs or a chatbot is that it's keeps that part of the business cost down. And then finally, and this sort of nicely segues us to what's happening next, is we found a lot of similarities on the e-commerce and retail websites. And apologies for the lack of clarity with the screenshot. But the point is that what it appeared to be happening was that the likes of Rebel Sport and Farmers were using the same content management software, such as, say, Shopify, which raises the question, are the dark patterns being created in New Zealand, or are they being imported through purchasing the content management software. So, if anything's ever going to be done about dark patterns, it's really important to know where they're coming from. Are they being created by New Zealand product owners or designers, or are they simply being imported when we purchase third-party software? It's a question that I'm looking to explore further. I have interviewed a number of UX designers throughout this country, and we asked the designers about their knowledge of dark patterns, and the results were that was clearly quite mixed. Some people knew a lot, some people hadn't ever heard of them before. So I think there's certainly the need to do further research here. So that's kind of gives you an idea of the research that we did, and moving towards sort of what's happening next. We've done a little bit of engagement. We wrote a piece for The Conversation a year or so ago, which was great. We ended up on the radio on RNZ. My colleague, Dr. Lacey, was on RNZ. Where, as this is something I'll talk about on my final slides, one of the challenges of dark patterns is that it's not really clear what sort of government agency should own the space, or because it's not only an issue of online commerce, but also privacy. There's also something around spam in there that from what I understand, DIA typically is in charge of. So it's perhaps an issue that requires cross government agency consultation, which is something that we've tried to do. And it's awesome that we've been invited to speak at Privacy Week to try to promote what we do. So what's next? As I was saying, there's a sort of broader question with, if we can agree that this is an issue and online users are not getting a fair deal, where perhaps our behaviors are being manipulated to give away more data and to make commerce unfair, what can we do about it? And that's a big open question. There is quite a lot of movement overseas, and that link that I had at the start, Harry Brignall, deceptive.design, they actually are helpfully listing a lot of the litigation and some of the new pieces of law that are emerging in the States and Europe to try and combat dark patterns. But it's quite a complex and difficult area to stay on top of. But there is some work that perhaps we should be looking towards. And then, I've got some ideas about my next research project. Well, more than ideas, I'm about to start. So now that we know that dark patterns are here, if we want to do anything about them, you really need to prove that they work. Perhaps we all have anecdotal experiences, and we know that they have worked on us before, but you actually need to prove in a more of an empirical setting that they do work and they cause harm. So I'm currently designing an experiment to try to do that, to put users through digital environments to see if the dark patterns work, and more than that, actually see if they work on different types of users. So in particular, I'm going to be looking at groups of students or younger people, 18 to 34-year-olds, and then also people 65 and above, to see if age is a factor and whether or not dark patterns work. So that's what's happening next, and I'd love to hear any ideas or feedback on that, as well as the whole talk. So that brings us to a close. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you found it interesting, and looking forward to reading some of the questions. All right. So going through some of the questions. Yes, Hazel asked, how do we get hold of your paper? So yeah, if you just saw the link in some of those slides, or if you Googled my name or clusters of dark patterns in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that'll take you to the journal, and it's open access. So you should be able to get hold of it that way. Maybe I'll type the answer in as well once I get through some of these. Yeah, okay, I'll put the link in the chat. I can do that. Oh, thank you, Diane. Bit of crowdsourcing going on here. And Natasha asks, were any .co.nz sites more dark than others? Yep. Anecdotally, I can say absolutely. I think Culture Kings was pretty dark. If we talked about, if we're simply referring to the number of dark patterns, if that's what you're meaning, the Chemist Warehouse, I think, was pretty dark as well. But I'd have to go back to the data and actually give you sort of the top 10 offenders, if that's what you're asking. It wasn't one of our research questions, so that's why it's not a hand. Was the study websites as they appear on desktop or mobile? Do you think that would make a difference? Yeah, that's a great question. It was on mobile. Sorry, desktop. It was on desktop, and we did state that in our paper, I'm pretty sure. But it's a great point. Anyone that's created a website will know when you change to mobile viewing, it changes the UI, or the UX, and that's an important thing to be clear about. And it's also a reminder of how difficult this study was, because in a way, it's sort of like saying analyze the top 100 buildings in New Zealand. It can be so broad, and it's important to be very specific. So that's a great question. Thank you. James has provided a link to the question. Thanks, James. James asks, so how does New Zealand compare globally in terms of dark pattern prevalence and sophistication? Sadly, the field hasn't gotten to a point where we can actually answer that, but that's a sort of bit of feedback that's fantastic, because wouldn't it be great if we could actually compare countries? What I will say is, because things change so quickly in this field, this research was just published, but it was conducted 2 years ago, and part of that is the academic publishing process. It takes a long time, pin that. But a lot of the websites will have changed, so it's quite hard to sometimes get a strong sense of dark patterns in New Zealand compared to another country, because it can change so quickly. But that could be a great study. I really like that suggestion. Thanks, James. Vicky asks, how many of these dark patterns do you think are already baked into the e-commerce platform like Shopify? Yeah, that's a great, I'm not sure, but I suspect quite a few. And again, it raises this question of who's responsible. Is it individual designers, or is it are they more rolled into the platform, or sorry, the software package? So that's a great question, and I'm not sure if you asked that before I got to that point or not. But thanks for asking. Josh asks, not all websites receive the same traffic. I visit stuff.co.nz far more than skinny.co.nz. If results were weighted by number of people visiting the websites, do you think that would significantly change results regarding the dark patterns? Yeah, I mean, that's another, that's an excellent point. If we wanted to sort of say with more certainty where are New Zealanders most likely to encounter a dark pattern, we would want to do that weighting. We didn't do that, but that's a great point to be able to come to a different, more specific claim. So thanks for offering that comment. Flora asks, what do you think regulation in this area might look like? It's a great question. And the best way to answer it specifically is to go to the Harry Brignall deceptive.design website, and he and his team actually go through all the different ways in which regulation is looking like. So rather than giving you just my thoughts, you could look at what others think, and how they've sort of tried to give it, a high-level picture. And I know in California, they've got a California consumer privacy piece of legislation, where there's actually specific wording about what designers should and shouldn't be doing. So there is sort of guidance in that instance. What I like to think, maybe I'll just answer at a sort of a higher level, which is, I think what we need is design standards. I don't necessarily think this is something that can be outright banned, because it's very difficult to draw the line and say sometimes that's dark pattern and that's just elegant UX design. Sometimes with the most egregious ones you can, but it's quite a tricky area to always draw your line in the sand and say this is where the design becomes dark. And so rather than just saying outright banning dark patterns, what we might need is some sort of design standards where we can, move towards best practice. And I think, this is something that I've discussed with UX professionals, because from what I understand, UX professionals are under pressure to deliver projects, and therefore there's often not the time or the resources to do best practice. But if best practice became more of an industry norm, then that would reduce some of that kind of individual project level pressure. So, we have a building code, right? For physical in real life builders and designers, we have an understanding of what is ethical or safe design. Perhaps we need something similar in UX design, where we understand that if you use color and you place the button in this area, that may be unethical. We need to move towards that, but I think it's going to take some time. Emma says, thanks, really clear. Oh, thank you, Emma. Appreciate it. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Richards, is there a risk that researching and publishing the efficacy of undermining? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a great question. I want to say no. I think the need for evidence outweighs how that evidence may be used. What I will say is the types of dark patterns that I'm going to look to simulate are already being used. So things like opt-in, opt-out. I'm not looking to create really innovative dark patterns here. I'm just looking to prove that perhaps the most common ones that New Zealand users come across do work. So I appreciate the question, but I hope that by raising awareness about this issue, it'll create more ethical design standards in the long term, as opposed to making the issue worse. But if it does, I'll remember this point in time. Thanks, Richard. Hayden asks, just wondering if the marketing funnel is the other side of dark patterns. Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you remember, one of the conclusions I had was dark patterns are mechanisms to drive sales. There's one argument that, what's different, isn't dark pattern just the next stage of marketing? And in some ways it is. What I will say, so I would say that marketing is a key part of dark patterns, but a dark pattern goes beyond it, because it's about design more broadly. So it's not just about price comparison and connecting consumers to the right information so they can make considered purchases, but it's designing the complete digital environment. So it goes beyond just marketing. But it's a really good point, and something that I would love to engage more with marketing experts on. Thank you, Jane. Appreciate the comments. Karen asks, since so many of the tools used for creating websites contain dark patterns, what do you suggest to get around? Great question. I'm not sure. I know that there are lots of movements around ethical design. If you Google ethical design or light patterns, there are some people who have reverse engineered dark patterns to think, okay, so if the use of behavioral sciences in this way can create a dark pattern, what if I reverse engineered it to create a light pattern? That's one thing to think about. Also, privacy by design. I'm sure a lot of people that are watching or listening are aware of privacy by design, and that's where you bake in privacy from the get-go. So I think there's a lot of merit in privacy by design, that field, that practice being involved in the solution. So look to that field. Libby asks, can you give more detail about the barriers on some websites that limited your research? So can I give more detail? We decided not to, if you think about, if I go into ASB or BNZ or Westpac, I can access the homepage and I can click around some of the, broader kind of external viewing parts of the website, but to actually get into, how important pages are designed, like accessing my accounts and managing to transfer money, there are specific user journeys within banking websites that we just couldn't access because we're not members of that bank. And the barriers to entry were just too high for this one research project. That's one example. Or, you know, accessing the Ministry of Social Development, their website, or IRD, you know, that would require, you know, either for IRD myself revealing some personal information, or it was just simply too hard to do so. So I think for me, those are really valuable websites to access, but they would be different projects. So I hope that answers your question. Judith asks, is choosing essential only cookies better than accepting all cookies? Does this reduce data mining by doing this? So I'm probably not, you know, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on cookies. There are people that certainly know more than me. But yes, yes, I mean, it's interesting with the GDPR requiring that websites require consent to use cookies. A lot of this issue in Europe has really focused on the design of the cookie window. Less so over here, right? Because we don't actually require consent to track cookies. Some of our website operators do because we have international audiences. But yes, if you're choosing only essential only cookies, then you're giving away less data, to put it bluntly. That's what I believe. Beryl, great that you're looking at different age groups. Age doesn't necessarily determine digital ability. Agree. How will you examine? I think I've just lost the question. I have, something's happened. Sorry, I just there you go. I'm back at your question, Beryl. How will you examine the effect on this lowest digitally enabled? So it's a great point. Thanks, Beryl. I have chosen to look at age simply because it's easy to do so. And again, it's for practical reasons. But I will very clearly note that age doesn't necessarily mean lower levels of digital literacy. It's just simply because of the resources that I have available to me. It's what I'm deciding to focus on, but it's a great point. Do you think all these patterns are malicious, Jane asks, or is it just that retail providers just follow trends they see in others? Yeah, I mean, there are specific, so I just had this moment where I realized I haven't ever answered so many questions at once, and so I'm just sorry, I just had that kind of out of body experience. Do you think all of these patterns are malicious? No. And there has been papers that have debated what makes a dark pattern dark. So others have explored your question in more detail. And yet part of the reason that they're so widespread is that I think people are just following each other, and it's in some ways they're the latest of digital marketing. So no, not all are malicious. And you know, there are certainly gray patterns, and this goes back to my previous point. It's pretty hard to actually draw a line in the sand and say immoral and moral. It's much more gray than that. Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, I mean, I would love to look at other factors, absolutely. But I'm thinking about feasibility here. So if in an ideal world, I would look at way more factors. And so if anyone's got other ideas, please suggest. Grace, I've just lost Grace's question, so I'm scrolling back up. Are all dark patterns equal? No. I think there are some that are worse than others. Thanks for the follow-up, John. Gavin, yeah, that's a great point. There is mixed feelings about how effective GDPR is at limiting dark patterns. So that's a great point. Eduardo asks, are there dark patterns that are increasing or decreasing in popularity relative to the rest? Good question. Good question. I mean, it depends on, I think, whether the offenders are punished. So right at the start, I pointed towards that LinkedIn example, and they actually were fined quite heavily. And so no one, I think, does address book leeching anymore. Well, that's what I think. So other than that, I'm not sure, but that's a great question. Fiona asks, if there were to be recommendations for regulation, could a recommendation be that sign up is not required for a purchase? Websites that only let you purchase with sign up and obtaining. Yes, I agree. I mean, yeah, that's a great suggestion. Let's remind ourselves that if you are buying an item, you have to give away something, right? If I'm buying an umbrella, I have to tell the service where I live, because otherwise where they're going to send or to send it to somewhere, right? So you have to give away something to establish that business customer relationship. So I'm not trying to say that, you have to give away some data, right? But the question is how much data is necessary. That's the key. And that's what I appreciate about your question. One person's dark pattern is another good advertising or engagement. Yep. Yeah. Especially so for charities. No, exactly. I mean, the thing is that some of the biggest offenders of dark patterns don't come from places that you would think. So, as opposed to, the traditional bad industry like big oil or tobacco. No, some of the biggest offenders of dark patterns come from academic websites, international ones. Academic. Anyone in here that's an academic will know that ResearchGate is terrible. It's likely that charities could be using dark patterns as much as perhaps the companies that we look at with most closely or most scrutinize the most. So there is that kind of ethical, philosophical aspect about when does a dark pattern become dark. It's a great question. Hi Frith, nice to hear from you. What messages do you want marketers and UX designers to take from this? Let's co-design standards. Let's agree that there is manipulation going on to encourage end users to outcomes, and let's think about where we want to go to a place. What would standards look like? Is there such a thing as neutral design? What would a digital building code look like? I think that would be a message that I'd want to leave people with. Thanks, Hazel. That's the Harry Bignell website. Thanks, Titus. Oh, thank you. Just a nice comments. Michelle asks things like hiding terms and conditions. Consider dark patterns. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's quite a long list, dark patterns. But I mean, terms and conditions and the issue of legalese is a whole nother issue that I don't really want to touch. So I'm going to say unsure. Cheryl asked, not a question, but as an ex-Shopify employee, I can confirm that we used to have to strongly encourage the merchants to install third-party apps to the stores, almost all of them with some form of dark pattern. Thanks, Cheryl, for sharing that. That's really really helpful. Thanks, Sandra, for the comments. Oh, thanks, Hazel. You've been engaging quite a lot, so really appreciate your comments. Will the recording be available? I'm going to assume yes. You'll have to, someone from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner will probably have to answer that. Jonathan asks, in terms of what regulation may look like, you may want to consider review anti-spam legislation, some of which has specific requirements for, say, prominence of non-script. Thank you, Jonathan. Really appreciate that comment. I will do that. Thank you. Marina asks, any good positive website without dark patterns in New Zealand? Yeah. Yes. I can't remember, but yes, there were. Yes, I mean, in the end, I think we said that 54% of websites had dark patterns. So, that's 46, right? So there's some that don't use them. And I think it's really what sort of website. So if the website's never trying to sell you something, if it's just a Wikipedia, for example, I know it's not a New Zealand website, but you don't find many dark patterns on Wikipedia. Thinking about it now, I know that they ask you to donate, so maybe that changes. But when there's less sort of financial transactions embedded in the process, maybe there's less dark patterns. Kamas gives recorded. Thanks, Jack. Jack asks, you mentioned a set of design standards would be perhaps more appropriate than a ban. Do you have a specific wish list of, especially with the candidates, make it easy to make account? Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of, I think, neutral pathways. So I think that's a principle that would be quite cool to be in privacy by design. So every pathway is neutral. So to be able to change your privacy settings, it's as easy as to set them in the first place. That's one thing. I wonder what farmers might do with the data they glean from dark patterns. Do you know how it is used? No, because I don't work at farmers. And one of the challenges in this area is access to data. So, you know, I'd love to be let into Facebook and know how they use the data, or some of these New Zealand businesses, but for very understandable reasons, it's proprietary and they won't let me in. Is there research on the relationship between dark patterns and legal concerns about click-wrap contracts? Yes, there is. There is a legal scholar called Ari Waldman, from memory, who writes about that. And I think what's at a sort of, what I can say at a high level is that dark patterns complicates and challenges a lot of long-held assumptions about informed consent. Because how informed are you if a dark pattern is being used? That's one for the lawyers. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Eduardo. Oh, cool. So people are just sort of saying goodbye. Well, as I said, that was a whirlwind of answering questions. And I really appreciate feedback, particularly some of those comments are very helpful in terms of next steps, thinking about standards, other research projects. So, you know, thank you so much. Good luck spotting and avoiding dark patterns, and please get in touch if you've got anything else to say. My email's not on the screen. That was an omission. But if you Google Alex Beattie, Victoria University of Wellington, you'll be able to find me. So yeah, please get in touch if you want to have a further chat or got anything else to say. Otherwise, thank you so much. A few curly questions. I mean, I've definitely had worse. But yeah, I really appreciate your, the engagement and your time. Enjoy the rest of Privacy Week, and ka kite.